Hey there, focus learners, and welcome back. We have got a seriously fascinating explainer lined up for you today. We're going to be decoding the actual mechanics of complex literature. You know, if you've ever felt completely, utterly lost reading a piece of text, maybe you're having flashbacks to the trauma of high school English class where everyone else seemed to magically get a poem except you. Well, you are in exactly the right place. We're about to break down a really precise, logical toolkit that takes that confusing wall of text and turns it into total clarity.
Think about it. What actually happens when you just don't understand a poem? Look, we have all been there. You read a stanza, the imagery feels totally fragmented, the structure isn't obvious at all, and you just hit a wall. It is incredibly frustrating. But instead of throwing our hands up in defeat or just wildly guessing at the meaning, what if we had a reliable, almost mathematical toolkit to unlock it?
To find that exact toolkit, we're turning to a highly detailed set of official statements by the author known as Solid Seething. His real name is Sago Stephen Kofi, and these statements were published on June 30, 2026. He argues this: the granddaddy offers a different approach, one rooted in honesty, patience, and precision. So throughout this explainer, we are going to meticulously unpack his literary philosophy and see exactly how you can apply it.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the poetry problem, move into the solid test excavation and the fluid test, ITFIF, hit the coherency clarification, run the me-we stress test, and finally, welcome you to poetic cosmology. Let's dive right in. All right, Section 1, the poetry problem, frustration versus precision. Let's talk about our knee-jerk reactions to tough reading.
According to Kofi's June 2026 statements, when readers stumble into a poem they don't get, they usually fall back on a few lazy reductions. Basically, they just give up entirely. Or they look to others and blindly accept what they're told without any rigorous questioning of their own. Or, and I know I've been tempted to do this, they just reject the poem outright, assuming it's pretentious nonsense. But Kofi argues that these reactions lack fundamental discipline. We really shouldn't just project whatever random feelings we want onto a poem, and we definitely shouldn't run away from it. Instead, we need to apply two highly disciplined tests.
Which brings us to Section 2, the solid test, excavation. This is the very first essential tool in our new toolkit.
Kofi lays down a very precise definition for excavation. He defines it verbatim as arriving at the main meaning, the actual reality, interpretation of the poem, the one the architecture confirms. So what does that actually mean for us as everyday readers? Well, it means that some poems are built with clear, undeniable structural tools. We're talking specific forms, strict wordplay, hidden acrostics. The poem itself literally hands you the tools. When that happens, you aren't free to just guess or superimpose your own feelings. You are required to follow that architecture and dig out the singular, main meaning that the author intentionally built into the text. You have to excavate.
But wait, Section 3, the fluid test, or ITFIF. What exactly happens when the poem doesn't hand you those obvious structural tools?
That is where the second tool comes in. Kofi defines his verbatim as the fluid test, or the ITIF test. And ITIF brilliantly stands for if it fits, it fits. His text states, if the meaning fits, if it applies consistently and coherently, then it is valid. You see, when a poem's structure just isn't clear and the images are abstract or fragmented, you simply don't have the architecture to excavate. There's nothing to dig out. So instead, you take a proposed meaning, you superimpose it right over the text, and you test it aggressively to see if it holds up.
So here it is. This is the core dichotomy of Kofi's entire framework. You have to know exactly which tool to pull from the belt. If the poem is clear and has architecture, you use the solid test. You follow the structure, you excavate, and you absolutely do not superimpose. That would be lazy. But on the flip side, if the poem is unclear and lacks that obvious architecture, you shift gears to the fluid test. You superimpose a meaning, and you test the fit. It is this beautiful, logical flow that completely removes random guesswork from literary analysis.
But let's be super clear about something here. The fluid test is absolutely not an excuse for lazy relativism. You can't just make a poem mean whatever you want it to mean. Kofi actually outlines a strict, disciplined set of escalating hurdles your meaning has to clear. Like, does this meaning actually cover the whole poem? Does it explain the specific images without awkwardly forcing them? Does it hold consistently from the very beginning to the very end without contradicting the text? Does it leave absolutely zero gaps? If, and only if, it passes all these criteria, then it is a valid fit. You hold that meaning lightly, and you wait to see if an even better fit comes along later.
Section 4, the coherency clarification.
Let's pause for a second to really connect the dots between the two source documents provided in Kofi's statements.
Because this is where the framework gets truly profound, bringing both of Kofi's texts into perfect coherence. The fluid test is verification, not invention. Let me say that again. Verification, not invention. You, stepping in as a second reader, aren't just inventing a meaning out of thin air. Usually, a first reader, like an expert critic, a teacher, maybe a long-standing literary tradition, has already excavated a possible meaning. They hand that meaning down to you. Your job with the fluid test is to superimpose that handed-down meaning onto the text to verify if it actually fits the architecture of the poem. You are verifying a fit, you aren't creating it from scratch.
Section 5. The Me-We stress test. Let's take these theoretical tools and see how they actually behave in the wild.
Kofi sets up a great contrast here with two different poetic scenarios. First, imagine a poem simply about the moon. Because there is no rigid mechanical architecture there, the moon could be a distant lover, right? Or it could be literal light in the darkness, or a lonely soul. Multiple meanings fit perfectly. Therefore, you have to use the fluid test. On the other hand, Kofi gives us the example of a specific poetic form he calls the door. This poem has a built-in acrostic. The architecture confirms one and only one actual reality. Because the poem literally hands you the key, you must use the solid test to excavate it.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. Kofi takes these highly disciplined rules and stress tests a famous two-word phrase, me-we. Some critics try to argue that because you can project heavy, deep meaning onto me-we, it passes the fluid test and counts as a poem. But Kofi, he completely shuts this down. Why does me-we fail? Well, first, it fails the solid test. Why? Because there is zero structural architecture to excavate, no built-in key. Second, because no meaning can be excavated, there is no meaning for a first reader to hand down. Therefore, it automatically fails the fluid test, because a second reader has absolutely nothing to verify against the text. If you write a full paragraph explaining what me-we means, you are engaging in pure invention, not verification.
Finally, Section 6. Welcome to Poetic Cosmology. Let's zoom out and look at the massive philosophical implications of Sagoe Stephen Kofi's framework.
What we've been looking at today isn't just a reading strategy. It is an entire worldview on literature. Kofi calls this poetic cosmology, and he defines poetic cosmology with 4 really powerful verbatim phrases: the science of originality, the architecture of emotion, the faith of precision, the surgery of belief. I love that last one. This shows us that engaging with poetry isn't just fluffy interpretation, it's a rigorous discipline of truth. It's about deeply respecting the structural integrity of a text. It's almost like you are operating on belief with surgical precision, finding the exact architecture of human emotion.
Kofi writes, "Hold what holds. Wait for what holds more." It's such a brilliant reminder to remain open. When you find a meaning that fits a complex text, you keep it, you use it, but you never turn it into an idol. You stay disciplined, always ready to verify a deeper, more profound meaning when the architecture of the text reveals it. So, the next time you encounter a difficult, frustrating piece of writing, don't just guess. Stop, look at the text and ask yourself the ultimate structural question. Am I meant to excavate this, or am I meant to test the fit? Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and as always, keep learning.